right. We're good now? Okay. We're going to be just finishing up. Last week we had David and Goliath. And we didn't just read the last few verses and then get into the next chapter. We're not going to finish all of 1 Samuel chapter 18 this week, for sure. There's some tangents, not the least of which is something I'd like to, before we even get to the word, to God's word that we're going to be studying this morning. This was just a really interesting, for me it was a really interesting point. Not that I discovered this week, but it does come up in this week's Old Testament reading. I think it was in, it was in Advent, talking about the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and saying, you will have a child. And somebody, and I should have documented it, I can't document it, but somebody was saying, if you go back to Genesis 3:15, it's actually proof of a prophecy of the virgin birth. And I'd never heard that before, and it's actually fairly convincing. If you go to chapter 3, verse 15 in Genesis, and again, this is one of those things that it's not obvious, but as a Christian who says, I believe that God wrote this Bible, you look and you say, yeah, it's there. I see the footprints in the sand. 3:15, God said, I will put hostility between you and the woman and between your seed and her seed. And in speaking of her seed, he will crush your head and you will crush his heel. And the point was that phrase, her seed, is unique in the Old Testament. Dozens of times when speaking of children, it always says his seed. Thinking of the father's line. This is the only time it ever uses that phrase, her seed. And why is that? Because Christ was not born of a man, but of a woman. Anyway, it was just, and that's all there is to it. But it's pretty neat, I thought, to think. That's one of those kind of subtle prophecies that you're going to miss if you're approaching it from a skeptical mind point. But when you know the story, you believe what God has said, you say, wow, it's there. It's there.
A subtle hint.
Yeah, it is. And so with that, now we're going to get to what we were looking at today, the Bible history. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And Pastor Otto's probably thinking, I can't believe it took you 27 years of ministry to realize that point. But anyway, okay, some of us are slower.
Better late than never.
What's that?
Better late than never.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So we were in 1 Samuel 17. David had just slain the Philistine in battle. We had read verses 45, 6, and 7. No, that's when he put his, we read farther, but we had read, I wanted to highlight that one verse. You remember David answering the Philistines' taunts, and just the important part is he said that, and all those gathered here will know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle belongs to the Lord, and he will deliver you into our hand. The point being, David, from the very beginning, he's giving credit to God in all things. Even in the middle of a battlefield. Wow. Something to think about. And then verses 51, well, I guess it's that last paragraph there. That's what we didn't get to, is the second half of 51 to 54. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah got up, cheering loudly, and pursued the Philistines toward the entrance of the valley, all the way to the gates of Ekron. Fatally wounded Philistines lined the road from Shearim all the way to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from pursuing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistines' armor and weapons in his tent. A little bit, not quite like life that we're used to, but that's all right. that was the account of David and Goliath. One of the things, like if you have my NIV Bible, it doesn't really break the story there. It breaks the story at the beginning of chapter 18. And this, if you have the EHV in front of you, you notice it puts the heading here and not at the beginning of chapter 18. Because, and this happens all the time in the Bible, where there is a storyline, so to speak, a news line, if you will, and the chapter divisions aren't always in line with where the breaks in the story are. Why is that? Are the chapter numbers part of what was given to us as God's word? No, they weren't. So they're useful because, and the history goes back to about the 13th century, so early 1200s AD. An Archbishop of Canterbury, I don't know his reason, there's maybe a story behind it, but to help people find their way through the Bible in the 1200s AD, he put in chapter numbers. And of course, it's tremendously useful. Rather than just say, find this passage somewhere in kind of the middle of 1 Samuel, you gotta, whoa, how do I do this? And then about 400 years later, they added, 300 to 400 years later, they added the verse numbers. And that's all very helpful, but it's not infallible. Sometimes people have said, well, he must have been riding a carriage when he was putting the numbers in. And sometimes when he would hit a bump, he would put the number in the wrong place. That's what they would say. And this is one of those, because I think it's right that really the division in story is at verse 55. We're kind of stuck with those chapter divisions. That's good, but just to know that. So, but thinking of David and Goliath, one note I had there, some see the use of a sling stone as a significant method of killing Goliath. Because, and we're not going to open to that, but in Leviticus 24, God said, whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord has to be put to death. How? Stoning. Stone them to death. The reason for stoning is to say, this person, and it's really horrifically symbolic, this person is unclean. You are not to even put your hand on the person. You don't want to be contaminated, spiritually contaminated by that. That was the reason for stoning to death. And some would say, which is what David did. He used a stone to kill this blasphemer, not just an unbeliever, but a man who had challenged the Lord God himself. And a thing that I did want to ask is, what moment of life was your proudest personal achievement? Your David and Goliath. Anyone want to share? You don't have to share, but if anyone would like to share, your proudest personal achievement.
I haven't gotten there yet. It wouldn't even be my achievement. It would be God's achievement.
Okay.
When I die.
Okay. And what the crown of life is yours. The book of Revelation just brings that out. Almost every verse of the book of Revelation, it has us focused on that as the victory. The victory. You're going to talk about in your life? Okay. When I was in high school, our football team won the state championship. I was on the team. I was a bench warmer.
Oh.
I was, yeah. In fact, I was mostly a tackling dummy is what I was for the team. So they got really good at my expense. But yeah, I got the jacket. So, I mean, question, did you give credit like David did? No, I didn't. As a 17-year-old there, I didn't. You know, it's not like I would deny it, but isn't it amazing how David, that moment, he just says, I have to let people know God did this for me. That's associated question. How do you feel about athletes giving credit to God?
It's good, but you have to wonder, I wonder sometimes, is it just a show?
Okay.
But I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. There's yeah. That's a wonder. I don't have a strong feeling. I'm mixed emotion on it. I'm glad to see people giving credit to God. That's great. On the other hand, you're wondering, well, then what happens when? And I'm not saying this in a pejorative sort of way. Okay, so then what happens when a Muslim athlete achieves something great and says, Allah gets the glory for this? Am I comfortable with that also being part of the conversation? And I guess I don't have the answer for that. Anyone have any insight about how they've thought about this over the years? Yeah, Pastor.
Well, I think Scripture said whatever we do to the glory of God.
Mm-hmm.
So, we could, no matter if we scored the winning TD or finished our work and the furrows were straight and or the corn grew because of our labor, not really. It's to God's glory or whatever we do.
Okay. That's maybe the more important thing is do all things to God's glory, and finally, just be sure that you're not garnering the glory for yourself, is maybe even more, is very much part of that too. But David gives credit, and I would say certainly it's a good thing for us to think about, to maybe be a little more conscious when things happen, to say, yep, but I'm glad that God gets the glory for whatever I was able to do. May God be glorified for it. And related, in the box there, I also had, throughout Western culture, the contest between David and Goliath is the metaphor for underdog victories. It's from the Bible, but people still use it. People often cite this story in a non-religious context. For example, if a 15 seed in the NCAA tournament upsets a 2 seed, they say it's like a David and Goliath sort of thing, which is okay. But how does that differ from the Bible's points of David and Goliath?
In the Bible, David was superior.
Okay.
He wasn't an underdog. He looked like one.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting, yeah. He was the better equipped out there anyway.
Don't judge a book by its cover.
What is the core? The one element so if we're going to go with, though, David looks like the 15 seed taking out the number 2 seed. What is one difference, though? I think the main difference just is the whole religious aspect. It's not just about the little guy winning. It's about God triumphing. Is what we need to, as Christians, we just should always have that in the back of our minds. Yeah, this is about God triumphing, giving the victory in the way that brings him glory. All right, and then the origin of the Philistines, another time we'll go into that. That's an interesting story. We're going to have ample opportunity because throughout David's time as king, he and the Philistines are fighting. So it is kind of interesting to look at, but that'll be another time. So we get today to 17 verse 55. So David is now welcomed. Well, I don't know if welcome is quite the right word, but it is sort of the right word. Welcomed into Saul's family here. So 17 verse 55. And this is the new stuff for today. I'll read the first few verses there. When Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? Abner said, As your soul lives, my king, I do not know. The king said, Inquire whose son the young man is. As David returned from striking the Philistine down, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. I think it's good if we just read the next 4 verses too. keep this all together. So David comes in. Who are you? I'm David. Let's read can someone please read the next 4 verses, first 4 verses of chapter 18. Bob. Yep.
When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan became bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved David, and he loved his own soul. Saul took David into his service that day, and would not let him go back to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because Jonathan loved David as his own son. Jonathan took off his robe and that he was wearing and gave it to David, as well as his other gear, including his sword, his bow, and his belt.
All right. One of the questions over the years, skeptics say, well, do you remember how David started in Saul's service? He was playing music. Because Saul was afflicted with an evil spirit, and David came in and was playing for him. Then, this is where the skeptic comes in and says, well, why didn't Saul know who David is? In verse 55 there. Not that we have to answer every objection people bring up, but this is just one of those places. It's just like Satan in the Garden of Eden. People who just like to find any little thing and plant that little seed of doubt. That's what Satan does. That's what the skeptic does too.
Well, if you're the king, you pay attention to the place of music.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
like who gave you the napkin at the restaurant?
Right. Good answer. Excellent answer. The king doesn't keep track of however many million people in his kingdom. So that's very much. And then also, he was in his service, but he's one of many people. He was, again, like someone had said, simply playing music when Saul was troubled. When Saul isn't troubled, is David in there playing music? Probably not. It's, as he's there. So again, just some of these objections people use. There are good and sensible alternates, understandings of what's going on, and it's not even difficult to understand. Okay, so in the first 4 verses, first David talks with Saul. Saul said, impressive, okay, young man. And then Jonathan really enjoys David's company. And this is going to be a theme of most of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel is Jonathan's and David's. It's a sub-theme, but their tremendous friendship. I think we're going to benefit, we're going to understand their friendship if we know a little bit about Jonathan. Now, there's not much told us about Jonathan, but if you go to chapter 14, I would like we're going to take a look at several verses there in verse 14. At chapter 14. What I would like to do is just, okay, who is this David guy? We've met him now, and we know a little bit of his personality. Bold, zealous for God. He's brave. He has quite a bit, it seems he has a way with words, a leader of sorts, even though he's got 7 older brothers. He hasn't been squashed. He's still got the vim and vigor in him. And then in chapter 14, we're going to meet Jonathan. Why would Jonathan and David have this seemingly natural mutual friendship between them? And I'll start, and we're going to read 14 verses on this one. So it starts again in the EHV with the last verse of the previous chapter. So there was a garrison. Just remember, this is before David shows up on the scene. A garrison of the Philistines took up a position by the pass at Michmash. One day, Saul's son Jonathan, so Saul was king at this point, his son Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come on, let's go over to the Philistine garrison that is on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul, who was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree that is Migron. The people who were with Saul amounted to about 600 men, including Ahijah, son of Ahitub. Ahitub was a brother of Ichabod, and the son of Phinehas, who was the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh. Ahijah was wearing this special vest. The men did not know that Jonathan was gone. So now some more of the logistics. On each side of the pass, which Jonathan needed to cross in order to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a cliff with a sharp outcropping of rock. The name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Seneh. One cliff rose up on the north side in front of Michmash, and the other was on the south side in front of Geba. It's just putting in front of us the battle scene. So it's a couple of outposts that are up in a high promontory, so they have a commanding position. And Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come on, let's go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised fellows. It may be that the Lord will exert his power for us, for the Lord is not limited. He can save by many or by few." His armor bearer said to him, "Do everything that is in your heart. Give it all you've got. I am with you, heart and soul." Then Jonathan said, "Here's the plan. We will cross over to them, and we will let them see us. If they say to us, 'Stay there until we come down to you,' then we will stay right where we are. We will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come on up to us,' then we will go up, because the Lord has delivered them into our hand. This will be the sign for us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "What do you know? The Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've been hiding." When Jonathan and his armor bearer appeared, the men of the garrison responded, "Come up to us. We have something to show you." So Jonathan and his armor bearer said to his armor bearer, "Follow me, because the Lord has delivered them into Israel's hands." Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer followed him. The Philistines fell wounded before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed him, killing as they went. That first blow struck by Jonathan and his armor bearer killed about 20 men within about half an acre of land. We're just going to read that much of it. So, hopefully that answers a little bit of your question. So what is with David and Jonathan? What do you see?
They both put their trust in the Lord. And he was brave enough and courageous enough to go against the Philistines, and it's the same kind of look of the battle, wasn't it, with how they were positioned when David went against Goliath? In the valley and mountains.
There's another.
Very similar to me.
Okay, they go into battle. First, Jonathan did have his armor bearer, but pretty much one man goes into it. Tremendous bravery, love for the Lord. Other thoughts? You see both of them, they just have this command about them. Not everybody is as bold as they are, and that's well and good, that's fine. But I don't know that I would be tempted to know that there's a fort full of people who want to kill me up there, and I say, "Sure, let me climb up there." Wow. But you do see a huge affinity between these two, David and Jonathan, just the similarity of soul, of spirit, giving God glory. Jonathan's not afraid to say it. The Lord, he can make this happen, and doing this for the good of God's people. So there's so much there. Going back to chapter 18, we notice some of the things. I'm wondering, should I have my mic on when I'm here teaching? I'm just wondering in the back here while I'm thinking of it. Is it? You're good? Okay. All right. In the first few verses of chapter 18, then Jonathan is the heir apparent of Saul's throne when he gives and what he does is he gives his robes and weapons to David. So these are royal robes and weapons. And it's a covenant. It's not just, this is serious stuff. It's probably a covenant of friendship, something akin to blood brothers maybe, but it's a serious grown-up version of that. And And they just pledged, and we're going to see it time and again in these chapters, that they pledged to look out for the good of the other at all times. The one thing we are not told is if Jonathan knew about David being anointed as king at this point. We don't know. We don't really know when David and Jonathan became aware of it, or when Saul and Jonathan became aware of it. But it kind of seems like maybe they didn't know just at this time. Next verse, verse 5. Let's see, and just to take note of this one verse all by itself. Anyone willing to read one verse, verse 5?
David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he was successful. So Saul put him in charge of a group of soldiers. All the people approved, as did Saul's officials.
Okay, so here we have things starting well between Saul and David. It starts well, and why not? David does what he's told. He's successful, and David's popularity displeased all the people, and Saul's officials as well. This appealed to them because for the last couple decades, the Philistines and Israel had been at war. Sometimes Saul and Samuel had been successful. Sometimes they had not been successful in war. So you have this oppressive nation next door to you who's always, and we're not just talking about like trade sanctions and saying nasty things about each other. This is war. This is killing people. This is destroying homes and livelihoods and taking people captive and all that stuff. David is successful wherever he goes, so of course people are going to love him. Thank the Lord for sending this man to rescue our nation. And the biggest, we're not going to go into any detail, but the biggest defeat by Israel was back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, earlier in that book, when even the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. So temporarily got back into the Israelites' hands, but yeah, all of that. So with David, they actually have hope. Next few verses. So it starts well. Saul brings him into his service. He's successful. The people love him. Good choice, Saul. Now we get to a change. 6 to 9. As the army was coming back from battle, when David was returning from striking down the Philistine, women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful music, with hand drums and noisemakers. The women sang to each other as they played, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." Saul became furious because he resented this statement. He said, "They have credited David with tens of thousands, but me they have credited only thousands. What more can be given to him but the kingship?" So Saul eyed David suspiciously from that day on. What do you think those women were thinking when they came out and sang that song? What does Saul think they're thinking?
Well, David's better than Saul.
Yeah. And what does that mean for Saul? I mean, in his mind. It's going to be jealousy is the emotion that's at work in him. And right, there's an insecurity there. Is it okay for somebody else to get credit for stuff? We say obviously. But if you're in a position of power and you're insecure about that power, and he's already heard from Samuel, remember, Samuel said, "The Lord has rejected you as king." Anything like this is a threat, right? Very threatening to him. And it's unfortunate that it's like this way. What do you think the women were thinking when they sang those songs? Do you think they're saying, "Hey, we want David to be king"? I hardly think so. They're simply, happy your husbands come back from war? Who wouldn't be happy about that? Some things that trigger jealousy when they mean nothing. Yeah, it's just this sort of thing, isn't it? Usually it can be where if we feel a rivalry and somebody else gets credit, we don't. These are the sorts of things that we need to, this is one of those temptations to watch out for. Watch out for jealousy. How would God have us react when other people are successful? These are, we can go to a couple different Bible passages I would like to take time at. John chapter 3. We'll come back to 1 Samuel. The first two are a couple examples of how to react. First one is a good, really good positive example. All right, so here's something that comes up in Jesus' lifetime. Early in his ministry, John the Baptist is still around. So we'll read verses 25 to 30. Can I ask someone else to read those verses, 25 to 30?
Then an argument broke out between John's disciples and a certain Jew about purification. His disciples came to John and said to him, Rabbi, the one who is with you across the Jordan, about whom you testified, look, he is baptizing, everyone is going to him. John answered, a man cannot receive a single thing unless it has been given to him from heaven. You yourselves are witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent ahead of him. Then John, who has the bride, is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and listens for him is overjoyed when he hears the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease.
How would God have us deal with other people's? Well, why would John maybe be jealous? Why were his disciples jealous? I should ask that. Why were his disciples jealous?
He would need followers.
Yeah. The crowds are getting smaller around John. And how do we see a godly attitude toward people's success here?
Be happy for them.
Yeah. That's a tough thing. When you lose out, like John was doing, in a sense. Although he realized, of course, he has the added thing. He realized this is the Christ. I mean, this is the center of it all. Is Jesus. So there's another little bit of an additional thing there to make it maybe a little easier. But he is happy.
You can't compare yourself to Christ.
Well,
the power of Christ and John's power. No.
Yeah. And he says, I've been given something. He does say, I've been given something, but not everything is given to me. So he's very happy for Christ and the popularity that he's having at this moment. Another one is in one of the Gospels, Luke chapter 10. From that first Bible passage from John, we're in Luke 10, but that one from John, again, thinking of the theme of the day of what do we do in temptation, that's one of those places. Okay, what did John do when he was losing popularity, and he was happy for Christ? Also here in Luke chapter 10, so Jesus has sent out his disciples, and they come back, and great things have happened. And if we can read verses 17 to 21. So then the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. He told them, I was watching Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Look, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will ever harm you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names have been written in heaven. In that same hour, Jesus rejoiced in the Holy Spirit and said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned and have revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, because this was pleasing in your sight. I think that the focus there is not so much about jealousy, but when his disciples have success, what does Jesus do? He gives credit to God. He is so happy about it. A wonderful thing there. Again, when people are successful, give credit to God and rejoice in that success too. And finally, the other one is Romans chapter 12, verse 15. We'll probably go to 10:50, so a good 45 minutes here, even though the kids are done already. We'll go another 8 or 9 minutes here. So in Romans chapter 12:15, really short little Bible passage. I love this, succinct to the point. Rejoice with those who are rejoicing, weep with those who are weeping. Why would you do that? That's a Christian reaction to everything. You're there with those people in their moment. Compassion for it. Which is easier? Just curious. Which is easier? To weep with those who are weeping or rejoice with those who are rejoicing? So, a couple different opinions on that. Why? So you thought Bob thought it's easier to weep with those who are weeping.
Sometimes it's harder to rejoice that someone is doing so much better than you are.
Okay. Yeah. It's in the next Forward in Christ magazine. It's one of the questions that's in one of the articles. That, like the headline question is, and I don't remember exactly what, because I didn't read the whole article yet. I just saw the top of it. And it's just that question is, why should I be joyful when I'm struggling and people who couldn't care about God are succeeding? And that's, I think, sometimes maybe weeping is difficult, but I think a lot of times rejoicing is the more difficult of those two things. Sometimes if it's family and friends, my kids do well, of course I'm happy. I'm rejoicing with them. Someone else's kids do well and my kids don't do so well. A little less. What's that?
That's a different story.
Yeah, right. It's just how petty we are by our sinful nature. It's terrible. It's terrible. Rejoice with those who rejoice. We can go back to chapter 18. So this is something that Saul. It's just another of the evidences of Saul having a broken, severely damaged. I don't know if I can say a completely severed relationship, but a severely damaged relationship with God. It's just one aspect after another of his life. He is not living by the leading of God's Holy Spirit. We've seen it in other areas and here too. There's this jealousy that's beneath it all. Verses 10 and 11. So back in 1 Samuel 18, verses 10, 11, and 12. On the next day, an evil spirit from God overcame Saul, and in a frenzy he prophesied inside the house. David had a lyre in his hand. He was playing as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand. He hurled the spear because he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. that can be a little bit confusing. Not because it's confusing, but because we get confused. So Saul is troubled by an evil spirit, and he's doing what? He says he's also prophesying. So an evil spirit from God overcame Saul. So like before, God had said to the evil spirit, you can trouble him. And in a frenzy, Saul prophesied inside the house. Now, the words, because we assume that when somebody says prophecy, we assume a couple things. First of all, when we say the word prophesy, we usually think he's talking about something in the future. He's like, like the fortune tellers or something like that that's going on with him. And that's not really what the word prophesy means. The word prophesy does mean speaking out publicly. And I guess I should have looked up the word a little more, because I can't say much more than that about what this word would mean. So it doesn't necessarily mean talking about the future, and it doesn't necessarily mean even from God. So what we have here is, under the influence of Satan, or of one of Satan's angels, Saul is speaking. I've had very limited, very, very, very little. My dad, as a pastor, had quite a bit more in his ministry contact with people who were messing around with the occult. I don't know if any of you have ever, but strange things do happen. And things that are inexplicable happen. And they just do, no matter what people, no matter how some people try to downplay this. And what we should think, this is what that basically is when you have people who are messing around with the occult. This is something that is also happening with Saul. Remember, not because God is saying, I'm going to get Saul, but because God is saying, Saul, you have made your choices. And finally, God says, these are the things that happen to those who choose me as an enemy. So Saul, in some degree, under the influence of an evil spirit, we could maybe even say possessed. I don't know if it's a fair word for that. And I guess, I'm not going to go through those two Bible passages, because that's kind of a rehash of what we had also said. Just a couple more examples of jealousy of the Apostle Peter, and then also in that well-known prodigal son. The prodigal son comes home, the father welcomes him home, but that's not where the story ends. Where does the story end? The story ends out in the field. Dad is going out to see the jealous older son, is where the story actually ends. Just this destructiveness of jealousy. And so much so that Saul is willing to take out the man who's responsible for all the military victories. That's just kill him because he's a possible rival. The length and depth of that sin. Okay, I think we're going to stop there. That's right at about 10:49 is what my clock is saying here at 45 minutes. We'll continue with verse 13 to the end of the chapter. It starts on the next. The one Bible passage, if I were to choose a key passage to take away from this morning, really easy to remember. Rejoice with those who are rejoicing. Remember that. When you feel that little bit of jealousy, or that person isn't worth it, or that's unfair, or whatever else you want to think, God says, just it's God's giving. Rejoice. Rejoice. All right. We'll close with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the good things you do for us and through us. We ask that you keep us humble through all the things you allow us to achieve. And we ask you to keep us rejoicing with all of the people and all that you allow them to do, especially when they are your people, our brothers and sisters in faith. Take us into this new week, ever joyful of what you have done for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.